Hi and welcome to this training session with Drink Drug Hub. Drink Drug Hub is run by North Yorkshire Horizons. It's a place where you can come to get the right information about drink and drugs. We've got videos, web pages, guides about drink and drugs, as well as the training sessions that you can attend live or watch a recording as you are today. The website for our address is at the bottom there at drinkdrughub.co.uk. And today we're going to be completing the drugs guide session, which is module 2 of our drugs course. And these are the things we'll go through really quickly over the course of this video. We'll look at the drugs most commonly used in the UK, where you can find reliable information quickly about any drug, and then we'll go through the key differences between depressants, stimulants and hallucinogens. And then there'll be a guide to understanding physical dependency and how they affect a person's decision making. Now, to begin with, we'll take a look at what the drug market looks like in the UK. And this is as the government understands it in terms of how many people are using which drugs. Now, the government doesn't give us data about all the drugs available in the UK, but the most common drugs consumed. So we have the cannabis market there with 2.3 million people using cannabis. It's by far and away the most widely consumed illegal drug in the UK and other countries with similar cultures to ours. Now we've got our cocaine market, almost 1 million people there. That market's growing quite significantly at the moment. We know more women are using cocaine and also more younger people are using that Class A substance. We also know around that cocaine market that these are generally people who are working, earning money and spending that money on drugs rather than committing acquisitive crime to fund their use. And we're also less likely to see those people in treatment services. Then we have our ecstasy market there, 500,000 people using ecstasy. They don't use it that often, and we'll look at that in a little while. And then we get our heroin and crack market, with those markets overlapping because the people using heroin are often the same as the people using crack. It's not very big, in fact it is shrinking, so less people are starting to use heroin than we have people who are quitting heroin or very sadly dying. So that market is shrinking. And then we've got smaller markets for amphetamine and novel psychoactive substances as well. So that's spice, and we generally see that now within the prison population and the homeless population. So that's what the market looks like. Now, in terms of numbers, you'd think that the main drug would be worried about is cannabis, but as we'll find out today, this isn't necessarily the case. Drug harms and drug consumption can be quite two different things. But one way to look at this in terms of why we're most worried potentially about, for instance, heroin, which is where a lot of the harm is in the drug market, is to look at the amount of money that's spent on these drugs. And when you look at it that way, suddenly you can see why the heroin market is so significant. We've got £4 billion almost spent on heroin each year, and a really significant amount of money spent on crack as well. So although this market isn't very big in terms of numbers of people, it's huge in terms of expenditure. If you use heroin, you're likely to use it quite frequently and spend a lot of money on it. In fact, if we compare our heroin market to the ecstasy market, you'll see they look very different. Even though there's twice as many people using ecstasy, they use a fraction of the amount compared to the people using heroin. And that gets us sort of thinking about why would that be different? Is ecstasy a much weaker drug than heroin? Well, there's different ways to look at that, and we'll explore that over the coming slides in terms of understanding why people use drugs differently. And it's not necessarily just about the pharmacological properties of the drug. But to understand drugs, there's two hurdles that we have to come up against early on. And they're really quite straightforward hurdles, and they affect everyone who's trying to understand drugs. And first of all, there's the sheer number of drugs available, and secondly, the names of those drugs. These two things can be really difficult to get your head around when you're trying to understand drugs better. To explore the first one, we can go to the government's website and ask them for a list of all the drugs that they're controlling by legislation. And this will give you an idea of how many drugs are out there in total, not just the small number you've seen on that slide to begin with. In total, you can look at all the drugs under letter A or B or C and keep going through this list until you find over 500 drugs in total. And this is just a selection of the drugs. It's not even the full list. So there's way too many drugs available for us to really research and understand each in turn as practitioners. And the other problem we've got is the names. First of all, the names can be quite complicated. They can be quite scientific because drugs generally are developed in laboratories by pharmaceutical firms, and they have scientific names attached to them, like diazepam or buprenorphine, for instance. But then those firms sell those drugs on the trade market, so they get trade names. So diazepam's trade name is often Valium, because the original manufacturer marketed it under that name. But then when it hits the streets, people who use these drugs give them street names. So Valium is often referred to as blues because they come as blue pills a lot of the time. So that means the same drug can have lots of different names, and that makes it really difficult to understand which drug people are talking about at times. And that gives us a problem with so many different drugs and different names for each of them. How do we learn what we need to know about each one in turn? And what I would say is it's very hard to know everything in advance. It's actually probably better and more practical to find the information as and when you need it in your practice. And for that reason, would recommend taking a look at some A to Z guides. We've got 3 linked to Drink Drug Hub that are worth looking at. The first one is probably the most widely known one. It's called Frank, also called Talk to Frank. It's aimed at young people, but it's really good for generic information about drugs as well. It does have some gaps in it, but the most common questions you'll be asking you'll probably find here. So you can go to the A to Z guide there, and there's a little bar that you can type the drug into that you're looking for. You can use any name that you know the drug by, the street name, trade name, scientific name. So in this case, we're looking at heroin, and it will say this is also called brown, gear, H, horse, skag, smack. All these names will take you to this page here, and it will tell you how you feel when you take it, what the effects are, how long it works, and how long the effects last for. So that's really quick, easy basic information. You can find it really fast either through Drink Drug Hub or through Google. If you type in Frank and drugs, you'll get there. We've got 2 others that we recommend. So in the middle, there's Drugs and Me. This is good for the recreational market. It's a website originally run by students, they're now graduates, and they look at the drugs most commonly used as part of the recreational scene, so nightclubs, festivals, those kind of drugs. So you can get really good information there on their guide. And then if you're a professional looking for professional standard information, so really quite detailed information about the pharmacological properties of drugs or the legal status of drugs, or the history of those drugs, you can find that with Drug Science, and we've got them listed on our professionals page. So those are 3 places you can go quite quickly to get information that you need. I'll also talk to you a bit about crowdsourced websites like Psychonaut Wiki. Now we don't link those to Drink Drug Hub, but they are worth knowing about. These are websites run by people who use drugs, and they share information about the drugs that they use. And you can log on to them and have a look around the website to learn a bit more about the substances you might be working with. So this is Psychonaut Wiki, and that's a page from Psychonaut Wiki. It looks like Wikipedia, that's the one about heroin. And as I say, these sites are maintained by people who use drugs. They are seen as legitimate information sources. So for instance, if you go to Crew in Scotland, which is a drugs charity, who writes really good resources, which we'll also look at, they will use Psychonaut Wiki and some other sites as well to inform their guides. So Drugs and Me, Tripsit and Roll Safe and Erowid are all similar sites and also worth taking a look at. But if you want to start with one, we would say have a look at Psychonaut Wiki. The other really good advantage of this site is that you can get some guidance on dosage for drugs. So it will give you a bit of information in terms of how much is a small dose, a medium dose, or a really heavy dose of a drug. And I would say that's really useful to look at because it's quite hard to get this information elsewhere, but do use it with care. Now you need to use it with care because of this. Drugs are an unknown quantity on the illegal market. You can't really be sure how potent the drug is that you're taking, so you can't really be sure exactly how much to take. And there's a screenshot on the screen of drug purity that we know of across Europe. As you can see, it can range really quite wildly in terms of what you're actually consuming. But that guide is quite useful to know broadly where people probably should be with their dosage. Now, the other thing that we'd recommend if you're looking for information about drugs is take a look at some user guides. We've got 5 listed on the site by Crew, and we would recommend taking a quick flick through these. Particularly the cannabis one is really useful. It'll take you about 10-20 minutes to flick through them, and it'll give you really good information about how people take the drugs, how to take them more safely, and what risks to be mindful of, particularly if you're mixing different drugs together. So definitely take a good look at those. The other thing that's really useful is this tells you a bit about the drugs themselves, but what we can use these guides for as well, or what we can look at in terms of government data, is how often people use these drugs. So, for instance, the government will tell us that they think with people who use ecstasy, they're using ecstasy about 7 times a year, use 1.2 pills at a time, and they'll spend about £90. Now, again, this isn't to say that because you're using less of that drug, it makes it a safer drug to use. We still have about 70 people died from ecstasy use in the last figures that I looked at in the UK. So you can take a drug and not really know how strong that ecstasy pill is, and you can overdose, and sadly, some people do die from that. So occasional use doesn't necessarily mean safer use. So that's what ecstasy looks like in terms of its usage for the average user. Cannabis users look like this. They're spending about almost £1,000 a year, but this covers a whole spectrum of use. People who are using cannabis daily and in a dependent way, and people who are just using it socially or very infrequently. Our people using cocaine, we know, use it on average less than people using cannabis, but they spend more money because it's a more expensive drug. So they'll use it on average 30 days a year. They'll spend £70 a time when they do that, so about £2,000 a year. But again, you'll have people in that group who are using it really extensively, and people who are really quite indifferent and not using it frequently at all. Now, the government doesn't give us information about benzos or amphetamine, but it does give us information about heroin. So we look at how people are using heroin, we'll see that they're actually spending a lot of money, like we've seen in terms of the overall market. So on average, they're spending about £12,500 a year, but some people will be spending a lot more than that. And they'll be using it daily because of the dependent nature of heroin once you become dependent to it, which we will come back to. But if you're looking at drug use and trying to understand drug use, there are two main things to think about. First off, it's how it makes someone feel when they take the drug. You can find that information out really quickly using one of those user guides. But the next thing to think about in terms of how often is someone using the drug and why they're using it that way, well, that's the second thing to figure out. Why is that feeling so important to the person taking it? And that's what we do a lot in drug treatment services, spending time with people to understand why it's so important to them to take the drug to feel the way they do. And that's something we'll look at more in the third session and final session of this series. In the meantime, we can proceed here looking at how drugs make people feel, because that's really useful in understanding drugs better. So broadly speaking, we can take all the drugs available, so over 500 of them, and split them into 3 groups on the basis of how they make someone feel. So one group of drugs make people feel exhilarated. These would be stimulants. They speed your central nervous system up. The most widely used stimulant is caffeine, so many of us will have experience of this. But in terms of the illegal market, these are the stimulants most widely used. So powder cocaine, crack cocaine, amphetamine. Spice is a whole category of drugs with all different numbers and names numbers and letters that you can see there. They're made from chemicals, generally imported from China, sometimes from India, and they're deliberately manufactured to mimic the effect of other drugs. They're also called new psychoactive substances. So these would be our stimulants. Then we've got drugs that make people feel enlightened. You take them and it completely changes your perception. You might see things, hear things, you'll experience hallucinations. And we call them hallucinogens or psychedelics. And there's a couple of examples of those there. Things like LSD, mescaline, DMT, magic mushrooms are all in this mix. And as you can see, ecstasy straddles these two categories. So it's a stimulant, technically it's an amphetamine, but it's also a psychedelic. And then we've got ketamine, which again is straddling the border here. It's a psychedelic, but it's also a drug that comforts people. And this is our third and final category of drugs. These are depressants. They slow your central nervous system down. And again, a lot of us will have experience of using a depressant because this covers alcohol. And most people in the UK drink alcohol. So we do have experience of that relaxed feeling that can come with a depressant. Even if it's a small amount, it can still have that effect after 1 or 2 drinks, and you can feel yourself feeling more at ease, and that's because it's slowing down your central nervous system. But opiate painkillers, so those are things derived from poppy plants, which is heroin and other drugs derived from poppies. We've got benzos, sleeping tablets, and pregabalins are all in this list here. They're all slowing your central nervous system down, so we refer to them all as depressants. Oddly enough, cannabis fits into all of these, so drugs can straddle these groups or they can fit entirely within them. What we'll do now is take a quick look at each of these in turn. If you can understand that the drug you're looking at falls into one of these groups, you know which group it falls into, there are certain things you can predict about it, even if you don't know a lot of other information about that specific drug. So if we're looking at psychedelics, hallucinogens, and that's the category of drugs that the drug you're thinking of falls into, there are certain things we can predict about it. So we know that these tend not to be addictive or lead to dependent use. Now, the one that I'd make an exception about on this list would be ketamine. Ketamine is a psychedelic, but it's also a depressant. Because it's also a depressant, it can lead to addictive or dependent use. In fact, ketamine is the only psychedelic that we will see within North Yorkshire Horizons at NY Rise. Most people using psychedelics do not end up in treatment services unless they've progressed to other categories of drugs. So actually, some people would look at these drugs and say these are probably quite safe to take in terms of they're not going to lead to addiction or dependency. But I would say be careful. So when you take these drugs and you go on a bad trip, for instance, you might have a good trip, you might feel really great, you might enjoy the experience and feel enlightened afterwards, but you can equally have a bad trip. And with these drugs in particular, they're very dependent on how you feel and where you are when you take them in terms of what the trip will be like. If you have a bad trip and you're very scared and terrified about the place it takes you to, there's no way to come out of that because you've taken the drug. And these can be really distressing for people. People, although they are not thought to get addicted to these drugs, can still be seriously harmed or even die having taken them. And that tends to be because of accidents that occur once they're under the influence. So they may not be somewhere safe when they take them. They may fall from a height, step into traffic, or drown in open water. We'd also bear in mind that anyone living with a mental health condition should be really careful with these drugs and ideally should avoid them. We know that there is research to suggest these drugs can be beneficial for mental health, but only when they're taken in a really specific way. Self-medicating with them at home isn't likely to really be helpful for your mental health, but probably destabilize it further. And finally, ketamine is the big one we'd pull out of here to say that is the one we'd worry about most in terms of harms. Now, it's also a depressant, can lead to addictive use, but it can cause serious bladder damage and overdoses. And we do have people dying from ketamine use. So that is the one we'd be mindful of, and that's the one that we will see within treatment services. Next, we'll take a look at stimulants. These are the drugs that speed up your central nervous system. Most stimulants have a reputation as being things that people might take to have a good time out, but actually a lot of them are also used in a problematic way as well. So crack cocaine predominantly is used in a problematic way. And you can see the same thing with things like amphetamine and spice. I say spice is mostly used now within the prison population, mostly because it's easy to smuggle in and out of prisons, or relatively easy compared to other drugs. And also we can't drug test for it. So if you're on a prescription for methadone and you take spice, we won't be able to tell that you've taken it. So again, it's part of that kind of scene rather than part of maybe the clubbing scene. Now, if we're looking at the clubbing scene, obviously there's ecstasy, which is a big drug that goes hand in hand with dance festivals. And again, young people use that and need to be careful when they're using that. But the most commonly used stimulant, and the one that we really want to take a look at, is cocaine. Now, this is really widely used at parties and nightclubs, pubs and restaurants. We know that the licensing team will go out and do drug swipes of the toilet facilities in pubs and restaurants across North Yorkshire and predominantly find that cocaine is present there. It can also be used in private settings and also during intimate times. So people will take this during sex, for instance, because it will heighten their pleasure. And they need to be really careful when using this drug. It is seen and predominantly and increasingly seen as quite a casual drug that people can take. We know young people are more and more experimenting and using this drug and not seeing it as a particularly harmful drug. And actually, this is increasingly becoming a harmful drug, as this data here shows. So in 2011, we had 112 people die following cocaine use in the UK or in England and Wales. But as of 2023, that's increased to 1,118. So a lot more people are dying having taken cocaine. There's good reasons for that in terms of what's happening. We know cocaine purity is going up and it's also becoming more popular. Now, the real problem with cocaine is it puts a massive strain on your heart. So we have people dying from cardiac arrest and also seizures. Nevertheless, even though lots more people are taking cocaine, we don't see many people in treatment. The government thinks only about 3% of cocaine users access treatment compared to about 50% of people who use heroin. So let's go back to this then, the two important things to think about, and we can look at this specifically around cocaine. In terms of how does it make someone feel, we can go to Frank and ask Frank how cocaine makes someone feel if we want to understand why someone's using it. And Frank will tell us it makes people feel happy, excited, wide awake, confident, and on top of their game. So it would make sense why people might be using cocaine if it makes people feel that way. But then we need to go to this question, why is it important to the person taking it to feel that way? And the reality is, for a lot of people, it's not massively important, and a lot of people would fall at the bottom end of this chart here. Like recreational users or recreational users, that means they either don't buy the drug at all, they just use it because their friends have bought it and are sharing it with them, or they buy it very infrequently and use socially. Now, it's not inevitable people start at the bottom of this chart, work their way to the top. In fact, most people don't. Most drug use does fall into that category. However, some people do end up at the top as a chronic user. That means they're now consuming as much as possible, they're building up debts, and it's really negatively impacting on all aspects of their life. Now, the reason why some people end up at the top of this chart and not others generally is because of this. They start using the drug as a way of escaping, rather than just maybe as part of a night out. And to demonstrate how that works, we'll look at this diagram here. So this is someone who is struggling with their reality. So it's not about they're enjoying a night out and they want to use a drug to manage that. And I'm not saying that this is a safe way to use a drug either, because we know lots of people do overdose and come to harm because they're using drugs as part of a night out. But in this case, we're looking at someone using a drug to escape and how this can lead to escalating and dependent use. So they've used some cocaine to escape their reality. It changes the function of their brain, it stimulates them, and it makes them feel euphoric. So they feel great having taken it. Now, the issue here is that it will only last for a temporary period. As soon as you take a drug, your body will start trying to metabolize this and break it down. That means after 60 to 90 minutes, you'll have had your come down, and your come down will actually leave you feeling worse off than when you started. If you've taken your drugs as part of a night out, you'll generally accept that in the same way that you accept a hangover after you've been drinking quite a lot the day before. But if you're trying to escape reality, the temptation is to use more drugs again, to escape that reality again. And then what can happen is you start getting some unpleasant side effects. Cocaine can make you feel euphoric, but if you take a lot of it, you start to feel anxious, paranoid, on edge. Well, people can self-medicate that by taking a depressant. So now they're slowing their central nervous system down as well as speeding it up. And the idea is they're trying to balance it out. And this means they can have longer binges and that sustain and more intense highs. Now, in terms of how this looks in practice, they may have a 4 or 5 day binge on alcohol and cocaine. Then they might have a little slip on a Wednesday and then another binge. That means they can have intense periods of heavy drug use and then periods without it. And they really kind of go on and off with this drug. Now, what's important to point out here is that stimulants like cocaine are not going to lead to physical dependency. They can lead to addiction, and that's where you've lost control of the behavior. However, you're not getting poorly when you stop. Now, because stimulants do not lead to physical dependency, there isn't a medication that can be prescribed as a substitute. So you won't get titrated onto a different drug instead of cocaine. And that might be one reason we don't see many people who take cocaine in treatment services. There isn't a drug we can offer as a substitute. Instead, what we'll try and do is reduce the frequency and intensity of binges with the goal of stopping altogether. So that's how we'd look at stimulants. But then we need to look at depressants. These are drugs that help calm your central nervous system. Now, a lot of these drugs are used to counteract other drugs, and we'll take a quick look at that now in terms of understanding how people mix drugs. So we've just seen that briefly in that diagram about people trying to use stimulants to escape and then balancing that out with a depressant. Well, this is what that looks like in practice when people are mixing drugs. In this case, someone's using alcohol, but the principle's the same for any drug in particular. You have an onset time from when you consume the drug. It builds up in your blood. For alcohol, this would be 20 minutes for you to start to feel the effects, and the peak effect would come out in 90 minutes after consumption. If you've drank enough, you'll feel drunk, and then you'll go through a come down period. Most people aren't aware of that when they're drinking because they sleep through it, but then they are aware of the after effect, which is the hangover. Now, just as people use cocaine to begin with, then might use alcohol to mellow out that feeling, people who drink heavily might start to feel sleepy, and actually feel like they need to perk themselves up. And for them, they might then take a stimulant like cocaine to counteract the effect of the alcohol. But what you'll notice now is the hangover is much more severe. That come down is really crashing quite hard. And then they also have anxiety from the cocaine as well as all the feelings from the alcohol. So some people who take drugs can then take another drug to help manage that come down. So they might take a benzo at the end of the night to calm them. And the other thing they might do is redose to avoid the come down entirely. Now again, if people are using as part of a night out, they'll probably accept that ultimately they have to come down at some point. But if they're using for pain and trauma and they're trying to escape their reality, well, they might actually never want to face that reality, which means they get to the come down and they will redose and redose and redose. Now, when people do that with depressants, and particularly if they do it with a drug like heroin, what you'll find is this redosing pattern can lead to addictive use and then physical dependency. And that's where it's slightly different to, say, cocaine use. So physical dependency, that means your body now needs, and specifically your brain and central nervous system need that drug to maintain normal functioning. And if you take it away, then people can end up feeling like this. And there is some detail about this on Drink Drug Hub. There's a guide to withdrawal that you can click on and take a look at and explain more about what's happening when you go into withdrawal. But in really basic ways, this is how you can feel. This person here potentially is suffering from withdrawal from heroin. These are the symptoms from heroin withdrawal. So they'll feel anxious, confused, unable to sleep. But a really big part of this are the physical sensations and the physical symptoms. So they'll be sick, they'll sweat, they'll have tremors and shakes, which is why people call it rattling, abdominal cramps and diarrhea, and their heart rate and blood pressure will go up, and they'll also have extreme chills. They can be very uncomfortable. Now, this person is trapped in a different cycle to the person who is using cocaine in a binge pattern, because they're not just trying to escape reality anymore when they use drugs. What they're trying to escape is withdrawal. And this means they're repeatedly going round and round on this cycle, having to take drugs every probably 7-8 hours. The actual effect will be 3 or 4 hours, but then they'll have to wait a little bit longer before the withdrawal symptoms start. And they'll need to keep administering drugs to stay well. So that means now they're having to use drugs daily like this. And that becomes really problematic in terms of living your life. Because every day you're going to need to go and secure a supply of drugs, and you're going to fund that. And this is going to dominate your life in terms of how you live and what you do with your time and the decisions you make. The real problem comes when you run out of money. So we've seen already with people who use heroin, the average spend in the UK and England, Wales is over £12,000. If you run out of money to fund that, we will see people engaging in higher risk behaviours. So they might start injecting the drug instead of smoking it, because that's perceived as giving greater value for money, because the entire drug will go in your bloodstream, which doesn't necessarily happen if you're smoking it. We'll see people more likely to mix their drugs, so particularly heroin with sleeping tablets, for instance, to try and prolong the effect of the drugs. They may turn to crime to fund the use, which is why that small number of people, again, the heroin market's not big, but that small number of people can end up being really prominent in terms of drug policy and what we're paying our attention to in terms of how do we treat drug harms. And the other things that can happen is people can become user dealers. That's where they build up a debt to a dealer, and instead of being able to pay that off, the dealer will flip them into selling drugs for them as a way of funding their use. And particularly with females, we can sometimes see they're exploited to sell the sex in order to fund their use as well. So this becomes really problematic, and it does make their reality harder and harder, which means they are more motivated to escape it and more likely to use drugs as a way of doing that. So it makes us think, how do you get out of that cycle? Well, in terms of physical dependency and managing withdrawal, we can replace the heroin. We do have a medication for that, and we have methadone or buprenorphine. We also have an injectable form of buprenorphine called Buvidal. So you would be titrated onto that drug instead of the heroin through a treatment service like North Yorkshire Horizons, and then potentially, if you want to come off those drugs in time, we can go through a reduction plan to do that. Now that is all covered in session 3 in this guide, but this is going to be a look through really quickly the different treatment pathways available for people on those drugs. So in terms of depressants, We need to look at physical dependency first. If the person is dependent physically on the drug, we need a treatment plan for that. If someone's using stimulants, we're more likely to look at binge behaviour and triggers for use. And if someone's using psychedelics or hallucinogens, we don't often see people falling into that category in treatment services, but if we did, the main thing we'd probably look at is set and setting. Where are they when they take the drug and how do they stay safe? And help them stop taking if they wish to stop taking. But again, it doesn't tend to be an addictive pattern. It tends to be more about personal safety if people are taking those drugs. So hopefully what we've done today is answered this question on the left. How does it make someone feel when they take their drugs? And as I say, that's the main focus for today's session. If you're interested in the next part of the journey for someone who's using drugs and exploring why the feeling is so important the person taking it and how do you manage that to help people manage their drug use better, that is in the third and final module in the series called Drug Support, and that will be available shortly as a recording. Now you can keep learning at Drink Drug Hub. Again, the website is drinkdrughub.co.uk and you can watch further recordings available shortly. Thank you for watching this one.